The room was dim, a single light hanging above the worn wooden table. The ticking of an old clock echoed through the space, as if counting down the seconds until the truth would spill. Leo sat at the table, fingers tapping against the polished surface, his gaze fixed on the photograph in front of him. His heart felt heavier than usual, weighed down by months of unresolved suspicions, vague feelings of betrayal, and now, undeniable proof. He could feel it in his bones, the kind of truth that cuts deeper than a knife, sharper than any insult or harsh word. The photo was of his wife, Jenna, laughing in the arms of another man. There was no denying it. Her eyes, which once held a world of tenderness for him, now appeared different. There was a flicker of something hidden beneath her warm smile, something that Leo had ignored for far too long. How could he have missed it? How could he not have seen the warning signs? Their life together had seemed perfect, at least on the surface. They had been married for 5 years. Jenna, a bright, ambitious woman with a smile that could light up even the darkest of days, was everything Leo had dreamed of. He had been proud of her, the way she carried herself, the way she made their house feel like a home. Their love had seemed like a fairy tale to him, each chapter more beautiful than the last. But now, that story was slowly unraveling, thread by thread, as Leo was forced to face the bitter reality of her betrayal. It wasn't the first time Leo had felt a nagging feeling, an instinct that told him something was off. Jenna had been distant lately, her gaze more often wandering than meeting his. They used to laugh together, stay up late talking about their hopes and dreams, but now their conversations were short and clipped. Leo couldn't put his finger on the exact moment things had started to change, but he had noticed the subtle shift, a gradual retreat into herself that had left him on the outside looking in. Then there was the phone, her phone. It had always been a source of tension between them. Jenna was protective of it, never leaving it unattended, always guarding it like some precious treasure. Leo had tried to shrug off the unease he felt whenever she glanced at it too quickly, or made a hasty retreat to another room to answer a call. The old Leo would have laughed it off, chalking it up to paranoia or insecurity. But now, as he stared at the picture, the words on the screen were undeniable, caught her in the act. Leo wasn't sure how long he'd been sitting there, staring at the evidence, but the silence around him grew deafening. His mind was racing, but his body remained still, as if he were waiting for the world to tell him what to do next. The betrayal hit him in waves, each one more powerful than the last. Anger, confusion, sadness, disbelief. He felt them all at once, mixing into a storm of emotion that threatened to overwhelm him. He thought about the life they had built together, the vacations, the plans for the future, the shared dreams that now seemed so fragile, so meaningless in the face of this truth. But amidst the storm of emotions, there was one feeling that lingered longer than the rest: betrayal. A betrayal so deep it seemed to tear at the very fabric of his identity. He had trusted her. He had loved her. And now, that trust lay shattered, like broken glass on the floor, too sharp to touch and too painful to ignore. Leo closed his eyes, breathing in deeply, trying to steady himself. What was he supposed to do now? How was he supposed to react to this kind of hurt? Would he confront her? Would he seek revenge? Or would he walk away, leaving everything behind and starting anew? He didn't know. The question hung in the air, unanswered, but the tension was palpable. His heart pounded in his chest, and his hands trembled. The truth was too much to bear, and yet he couldn't turn away from it. He had to face it, no matter how much it hurt. The door creaked open, and Leo's gaze snapped up. Jenna stood in the doorway, her expression unreadable. She hadn't noticed the photograph on the table, nor did she seem to notice the weight of the moment. Her hair, the same golden strands that Leo had once run his fingers through, was pulled back into a loose ponytail. She was dressed casually, wearing the same sweater she had worn when they first met, and her smile was the same one she had given him so many times before. But there was something different now, something that Leo couldn't place. "Hey," Jenna said softly, her voice a little too high-pitched, a little too forced. "I didn't expect you to be up this late. Is everything okay?" Leo's jaw tightened. His mind screamed at him to confront her, to finally ask the questions that had been burning in his chest for weeks, but his lips remained sealed. Instead, he took a deep breath and looked at her, his eyes locking with hers. It wasn't about anger anymore. It was about something far deeper. "Jenna," he said quietly, the weight of her name falling from his lips like a final judgment. "We need to talk." The room fell silent after Leo's simple yet heavy words. The world outside the window seemed to carry on as if nothing had changed, but inside, everything was different. The truth was hanging in the air like a dense fog, suffocating any attempts at normal conversation. Leo looked at Jenna, his heart still racing, his mind filled with 1,000 unspoken words, but none of them seemed right. The betrayal was raw, and it ached deep inside him. Jenna, however, didn't notice the tension. She looked at Leo with her usual soft smile, her eyes warm, though slightly guarded. There was something about her expression that Leo didn't quite understand. She didn't seem to recognize the gravity of the moment, the shifting of everything they'd built. "Leo," she asked again, her voice light, almost indifferent. "What's going on? You're acting strange." Leo's stomach twisted as he stood up, gripping the back of the chair tightly. His hands shook slightly, but the anger that had been boiling in him now took center stage, drowning out the other emotions that had swirled in his chest just moments ago. "Strange," Leo repeated, his voice steady but full of a quiet fury. "You want to know what's going on?" "I know everything, Jenna. Everything." Her face faltered for a moment. Just a flash of hesitation, but it was enough for Leo to see. She knew what was coming. She knew what he was talking about. "What do you mean?" she asked, but there was no longer any attempt to hide the nervous edge in her voice. She took a step back, as if preparing herself for anything, that might happen next. Leo didn't wait for her to play coy, didn't give her a chance to spin some story. His hand shot out toward the table, and he grabbed the photograph, the very one that had shattered his world just moments ago, and slammed it down in front of her. "Explain this," he demanded, his voice low and full of venom. Jenna's eyes flickered to the photograph, her breath catching as her expression changed. For a moment she froze. Then, she reached out, touching the edge of the photo with trembling fingers. Her gaze shifted from the photo to Leo, then back to the image of her with another man. Her lips parted, but no words came out at first. Her shoulders slumped slightly, as if a weight had descended upon her, too heavy to shake off. I didn't mean for you to find out like this," she said quietly, her voice barely above a whisper. She wasn't defensive. She wasn't trying to cover up her tracks. Instead, her tone was almost apologetic, as if she were preparing for the consequences of something she knew was inevitable. Leo wanted to scream at her, to demand how long this had been going on, how deep the lies ran. But instead, all that came out was a bitter laugh, raw and unhinged. "How long, Jenna?" Leo's voice cracked, the emotional storm he had been holding back threatening to consume him. "How long have you been lying to me? Was it really just a one-time thing? Or am I just another fool in your string of secrets?" Jenna's face fell as she looked down at the table, her hand resting on the edge of the photo, as if she were afraid to pull it away. The silence between them grew deafening. "It wasn't what you think," Jenna started, but the words felt hollow, empty. "It wasn't like that." Leo's anger flared again, this time scorching everything in its path. He took a step forward, his body tense, every muscle aching with the weight of betrayal. "Don't you dare say it wasn't like that," Leo hissed. "You've been seeing him behind my back. You've been—" "What was it, Jenna? What was I to you? A placeholder? A cover?" Jenna's eyes welled up with tears, but she blinked them away, shaking her head. "Leo, I never wanted to hurt you. I never wanted this to happen." The words were soft, but they were nothing compared to the force of the emotions crashing through Leo. The pain of it, The rawness of the lies was suffocating. He wanted to lash out, to hurt her like she had hurt him. The thought of revenge crossed his mind. He could confront the man in the picture, drag him into the open, expose Jenna to the world. He could make her regret it. The idea of revenge had a certain appeal, a sense of satisfaction that would make the pain feel justified. But then a new feeling surged within him: emptiness. Revenge wouldn't make this better. It wouldn't bring back the trust, the love they once had. It wouldn't heal the wounds that now ran deeper than the photograph in front of him. The idea of punishing her, while it might satisfy his rage for a fleeting moment, would only leave him feeling more hollow. "I don't know what to do anymore," Leo muttered, running a hand through his hair, pacing around the room. His emotions were a whirlwind, each one fighting for dominance. He was angry, devastated, confused, but above all, he was lost. "I trusted you. And you shattered that." Jenna stood in silence, tears now streaking down her face. She took a step toward him, her hands outstretched, but Leo flinched, backing away from her touch. "Leo, please," Jenna whispered, her voice desperate. "I'm so sorry. I know what I did was wrong. I know I've hurt you, but I never meant for it to end like this. I was confused. I was selfish. But I love you, Leo." Her words were a soft plea, a last attempt to salvage what was left of their connection. But the damage was done. The trust had been broken beyond repair, and no amount of words, no matter how sincere, could undo the hurt she had caused. As Leo looked at her, he realized that no matter how much he might still care for her, there was no going back. The betrayal had already seeped into their relationship like poison, and once something is poisoned, it cannot be purified by mere apologies. But even as he stood there, torn between his desire for revenge and the pull of something deeper, something more complex, his mind wandered to another thought. What if this was the moment where everything changed, not just for him, but for both of them? Could he move past this? Could he find a way to let go of the anger, the pain, and the desire for retribution? Or was this the end? In that moment, Leo made a decision, one that would change everything. But it wasn't the kind of decision he expected to make. It wasn't about revenge or punishing Jenna. It wasn't about winning or losing. It was about healing. Healing, even if that meant accepting a painful truth. Leo stepped back, his gaze locking with Jenna's one final time. "I need space," he said, his voice quiet but resolute. "I need time to think. I need time to heal. And I need you to respect that." Jenna opened her mouth to say something, but Leo turned away, leaving the room and her broken pleas behind him. His mind was swirling, but there was clarity in his decision. There would be no revenge, no violent confrontation. This wasn't about paying her back. It was about finding a way to heal his heart, even if that meant walking away from everything he thought he knew. Leo sat in the park, the sky overcast with clouds that mirrored the heaviness in his heart. His fingers gripped his phone, staring blankly at the screen. He had typed and erased the same message a dozen times. The words felt foreign on his fingertips, yet they seemed like the only way forward. The silence of the park was broken only by the occasional rustle of leaves, the distant murmur of the city, and the constant tick-tick-tick of the time slipping away. The text message he was about to send wasn't easy. It wasn't a message of anger or revenge, though that's what his heart had screamed for days ago. It wasn't about getting back at Jenna for the betrayal, for the lies she'd wrapped herself in. It wasn't about punishing her for tearing apart everything he thought he knew about love. No, this message was different. It was about closure. It was about taking back control of his life. "Are you sure you want to do this?" his friend, Chris, had asked earlier that day. "This is your chance to make her feel the weight of what she's done. Don't let her get away with it." Leo's gaze had flickered to his friend, but there was no answer. Chris was right, of course. Revenge, in its many forms, had always been a tempting choice. People hurt each other. It was part of life. But how you reacted to that hurt, it was a reflection of who you were. And Leo no longer wanted to reflect the man who only saw revenge as a form of closure. Would revenge heal me? Leo thought to himself now. Would it make this pain go away, even for a second? The truth was it wouldn't. Revenge would only prolong his suffering. It would keep him chained to the anger, to the betrayal. The more he thought about it, the more absurd it seemed. What did he want? What did he need from this situation? It wasn't vengeance. It wasn't a war. What Leo craved was peace, and peace meant letting go of the past. With a sigh, Leo put his phone down and leaned back against the bench, closing his eyes. He could still feel Jenna's touch from their last conversation, still hear the shaky, desperate sound of her voice pleading for forgiveness. He'd been consumed with the desire to make her suffer, to make her pay for the pain she had caused. But something had shifted in him, something subtle but powerful. Maybe it was the hours of silent reflection. Maybe it was the realization that, despite everything, he still cared for her, in a way that felt almost impossible. Or maybe it was the realization that by holding onto anger, by letting resentment build, he was allowing her to control his emotions. That wasn't the man he wanted to be. His phone buzzed suddenly, snapping him from his thoughts. It was a message from Jenna. She had sent it hours ago, but Leo had been avoiding reading it. The guilt had held him back, unsure of how to react. He opened the message. Leo, I know you need time, and I'm not asking for forgiveness. I just want you to know that I am sorry. More sorry than I've ever been for anything. But I also know I've lost you. I see that now, and I don't want to keep you tied to a mistake that I'll regret for the rest of my life. Her words, raw and fragile, broke through his defenses, and for the first time in days, Leo felt a crack in the emotional armor he had built. She doesn't want me to stay in this toxic place, he realized. She's giving me a choice too. As the weight of her words sank in, a new thought began to take root in Leo's mind. He wasn't sure where it had come from or when it had taken hold, but it was undeniable. Jenna had made a mistake. She had been selfish, yes, but wasn't he also to blame? Had he been blind to the warning signs? Had he ignored the growing distance between them? Did he love her so blindly that he failed to see her struggles, her dissatisfaction, and her confusion? The betrayal, as painful as it had been, was a consequence of something deeper. They had both drifted away, and while it wasn't right to justify her actions, he began to wonder if they had both failed to communicate, failed to understand the other's needs. Maybe this wasn't all on her. As much as it hurt to admit, Leo knew that holding on to the rage wouldn't allow either of them to heal. Jenna had apologized. She had owned up to her mistakes, but she was right. They couldn't just go back to the way things were. No amount of forgiveness could erase what had happened. But forgiveness, true forgiveness, would free him. And it would free her too. Leo took a deep breath. His finger hovered over the keyboard once more. He could send the message, the one that would bring closure, that would shift the dynamic between them forever. It would be the final word in their chapter, one where he could let go of the anger and hurt that had consumed him for so long. But then something unexpected happened. The phone rang. Leo's heart skipped a beat. He didn't even need to check the screen. He knew who it was. His hand shook slightly as he swiped the answer button. Leo, Jenna's voice was shaky, fragile, but clear. She had been crying. I've been thinking, and I don't want to let this go without saying everything I need to say. I owe you that much. Leo closed his eyes, pinching the bridge of his nose as the weight of everything hit him all over again. His breath was ragged, but the anger had already started to subside. He didn't know what Jenna would say. He didn't know how this conversation would end. But he knew that this moment, this conversation, was the turning point. This was the moment where his decision would either entrench him in the past or set him free. I've been sitting with everything, trying to understand how we got here, she continued, her voice breaking with emotion. And I know it's not your fault, but I've always been scared to face what I was feeling about myself, about us. I never wanted to hurt you, but now I see that maybe we were both lost in different ways. Leo felt a lump form in his throat. He hadn't expected this level of honesty, and for a moment it shook him. He realized that Jenna wasn't just asking for forgiveness. She was acknowledging her own pain, her own confusion, and the cracks in their relationship. And in that moment, something clicked inside Leo. He could keep punishing her for her mistakes, keep holding her accountable for the pain she caused. But what would that achieve? Would it make him feel better? Would it restore the trust they had lost? No, Jenna, Leo said, his voice steady but soft. It's not all on you. We both made mistakes. I didn't listen. I didn't see you. I didn't see us. And I've been holding on to anger instead of finding a way to heal. But I can't keep doing this. I can't keep holding on to the pain. He paused, the words feeling like an exhale after years of holding his breath. I don't want revenge. I want peace. I need to heal. And I think I need to do that on my own. There was a long silence on the other end. Leo didn't know what she was thinking, but it didn't matter anymore. He had made his choice. The weeks following Leo's decision to let go of the anger were not easy, but they were transformative in ways he hadn't imagined. In the immediate aftermath, everything felt like it was falling apart. His phone had gone silent, except for messages from Chris, who had continued to press him, asking if he was sure about his choice. Revenge is the only way to reclaim what you've lost, Chris had insisted, but Leo had firmly disagreed, ignoring the constant texts in favor of deeper reflection. Jenna, on the other hand, seemed to fade into the background. They had agreed on a final conversation, a last attempt to air out the residual hurt, but the words felt heavy and exhausted when they finally spoke. It was as though they had both run out of things to say, yet so much had been left unsaid. At first, it seemed as though Leo had been right to seek peace. He felt more in control than he had in days. The quiet that filled his apartment, the loneliness, which initially seemed unbearable, had begun to offer a new kind of solace. For the first time in months, Leo felt like he was living in a space that belonged to him alone, one that wasn't crowded by the weight of betrayal. He started to run again, something he hadn't done since he and Jenna had first moved in together. He used the mornings to clear his head, pushing himself with each stride as the rhythm of his feet against the pavement calmed his mind. But as the days wore on, the consequences of his decision began to reveal themselves in ways that weren't as easily dismissed. The inner peace he sought was still elusive, and the scars left behind by Jenna's betrayal ran deeper than he had anticipated. His emotional landscape had shifted, but the tension between what he had chosen and what he had lost remained. At work, his coworkers noticed the change in him. He wasn't the same Leo they'd known, someone who was always ready with a joke, always keen to lend an ear. Now, he kept to himself more, speaking only when necessary. His boss, Claire, had asked him over coffee one afternoon if everything was okay. "You've been distant, Leo," she said gently, watching him from across the table. "If you need time, I understand. But don't hide behind your silence." Leo had smiled a faint one and told her he was fine. But he wasn't fine. He wasn't sure how to explain it to her or anyone else, for that matter. He wasn't sure how to articulate that, despite choosing peace, he was still grieving the loss of the person he thought he would spend his life with. That night, after dinner, Leo sat alone in his dimly lit apartment, the weight of everything pulling him into a deeper reflection. He hadn't expected the emotional roller coaster that followed his decision. He thought that choosing peace would bring him clarity, but instead, it had left him with a gnawing emptiness. He pulled out a journal, the one he had kept during the first days after their breakup. Writing had become his form of release, his way of processing the pain without speaking the words aloud to anyone. He flipped to a page he had written weeks ago, just after the confrontation with Jenna. "I want to be angry. I want to lash out and make her feel what I'm feeling. But something inside me keeps telling me not to. What if forgiveness is the only way to truly be free?" Reading those words brought a bittersweet sting to his chest. He had believed that forgiveness would unlock his peace, But now, he wasn't so sure. He still felt like something was missing. Jenna had apologized, and he had let go of the desire for vengeance. But had he really forgiven her? Or was he just too tired to keep fighting? The problem was, forgiveness wasn't something you could rush. It wasn't something you could force just because you wanted to move on. The resentment, though less intense, still lingered in the corners of his mind. He didn't know how to let go completely. As he sat there, reflecting on his choices, he heard a soft knock at the door. Leo's heart jolted. He hadn't expected company, especially not after everything. He opened the door slowly, his gaze meeting Jenna's for the first time in weeks. "Can we talk?" Jenna's voice was quiet, uncertain. She had her hands tucked into her jacket pockets, and her eyes avoided his. Leo stood there for a moment, his heart racing. 1,000 emotions stirred inside him, but he stepped aside and let her in without saying a word. He didn't know what she wanted, or how to prepare for whatever conversation was about to unfold. "I've been thinking about what you said," Jenna began, her voice cracking slightly. "I've been giving myself time to understand what happened between us, what I did to you, and what we both did to ourselves. I'm not asking for you to take me back, but I don't want to leave things like this. I can't." Leo's eyes widened. He had expected this. He had known deep down that she would come back at some point. But now that she was here, standing in front of him, something inside him shifted. The anger and resentment he had been carrying, though it had dulled, hadn't fully gone away. And yet, seeing her now, in this vulnerable state, he understood something new. "You don't have to ask for forgiveness," Leo said, his voice low and calm. "Because I don't know if I've forgiven you yet. I don't even know if I can. But that doesn't mean I hate you. That doesn't mean I want to punish you anymore." Jenna's eyes filled with tears. "I don't deserve your forgiveness, Leo. I was selfish. I hurt you. I can't erase what I did. But I need you to know I'm sorry. I need you to know that this was a wake-up call for me, and I don't want to keep running from my own mistakes." Leo closed his eyes for a moment. The weight of everything, the past, the betrayal, the peace he was trying to find, felt so heavy. He wasn't sure how to process it all. The space between them felt unbearable now, but it wasn't just the silence. It was the realization that no matter how much they both wanted to heal, the scars they had left on each other would never fade completely. He nodded slowly. "I think we both need time to heal," Leo said quietly. "And we need to figure out what comes next, whether we try to move forward separately or find a way to rebuild." Jenna swallowed hard, her face pale. "I agree, but I don't expect things to go back to how they were. I don't think that's possible." Leo nodded, a faint but sincere smile tugging at the corner of his lips. "No, but we can both try to rebuild from where we are now." For a moment, there was a long silence between them, an understanding settling in the space where the anger once lived. It wasn't an easy peace. It wasn't an ideal one, but it was a peace that allowed room for growth. As Jenna left his apartment that night, Leo watched her go with a mixture of relief and sadness. He had made his choice. He had chosen peace over revenge. But what he hadn't anticipated was that peace wouldn't come without its own set of consequences. The process of healing was far more complicated than he had imagined. He couldn't simply forget. But as time went on, Leo realized that perhaps forgiveness didn't have to mean forgetting. It could just mean letting go. It had been months since Jenna had left his apartment that evening, and Leo had never quite shaken the feeling that something inside him had shifted permanently. The truth was, despite all his efforts to move on, the journey toward healing was far from linear. There were days when the memories would flood back, sharp and unrelenting, reminding him of the betrayal that had threatened to consume him. But there were other days, quieter ones, when peace would settle in like a soft breeze, bringing with it a quiet sense of acceptance. Leo's life had transformed in ways he hadn't expected. He had stayed in the same apartment, kept his job, and maintained his friendships. But there was something different about how he moved through the world now. The anger that once burned inside him had cooled, and with it, his perception of life itself had changed. He had allowed himself the time and space to truly reflect, to understand not just the betrayal, but his own role in what had happened. The questions of why had shifted into questions of how. How could he rebuild himself? How could he grow from this? And how could he keep moving forward? In those months after their final conversation, he had learned more about himself than he ever could have imagined. He had confronted the depths of his emotions, his fears, his doubts, and his insecurities, and he had come out the other side stronger. The pain from Jenna's betrayal still lingered, but it no longer held him captive. He was no longer bound by the need for revenge or validation. What had initially felt like an insurmountable loss had, in time, become a stepping stone toward his own personal growth. As the days stretched into weeks, Leo found himself settling into a new rhythm. His morning runs had become more than just a way to clear his head. They were moments of clarity, where his mind could wander freely without the weight of past resentments clouding his thoughts. He had taken up meditation as well, learning to quiet his mind and be present with whatever emotions arose. It wasn't easy, but it was a practice that gradually allowed him to understand the true meaning of forgiveness, not for Jenna, but for himself. One rainy afternoon, Leo found himself sitting at a cafe near the park. He hadn't been there in ages. The familiar scent of brewed coffee, the murmur of quiet conversations around him, all felt comforting in a way he hadn't realized he needed. He had finally reached a place where he could let go of the expectations that had held him captive for so long. The need for things to go back to normal, the desire for closure, the pressure to fix what had been broken. Instead, Leo simply allowed himself to be. He took in the present moment, the sounds, the smells, the peacefulness that surrounded him. His phone buzzed on the table, interrupting his thoughts. He glanced down at the screen and saw Jenna's name. His heart skipped a beat. It had been a while since they'd spoken, but he wasn't surprised. She had been trying to reach him on and off, sending messages, at first apologizing, then updating him on her life, and even inviting him to meet for coffee. Leo had always ignored them, uncertain of what to say, unsure if he was ready to reopen that chapter of his life. With a deep breath, he opened the message. Leo, I understand if you're not ready to hear from me, but I wanted to let you know that I've been working on myself. I've learned so much about who I am and why I made the mistakes I did. I'm truly sorry for everything I put you through. I know it doesn't change anything, but I wanted you to know that I'm doing better. The message was simple, and yet it carried an emotional weight. It felt like a final piece in the puzzle of their past. Leo stared at the words for a long time, contemplating his response. He could have ignored her message, could have continued living in the peaceful distance that had begun to define his life. But as he sat there, he realized that he no longer needed to run from the past. He no longer needed to hold onto the anger or the hurt that had once consumed him. He had done the work to heal, and now he was ready to move forward, whether with or without Jenna. He typed a reply. I'm glad to hear you're doing well. Thank you for reaching out. I've spent a lot of time reflecting on everything, and I think we've both learned some valuable lessons. I wish you nothing but the best, Jenna. It wasn't a grand declaration. It wasn't an invitation to rebuild their relationship, nor was it an expression of anger. It was simply a message of acknowledgement, a recognition that both of them had changed, and that they were each on their own path now. After sending the message, Leo sat back in his chair, a sense of peace settling over him. He didn't know what the future would bring, but for the first time in a long while, he felt confident that whatever came next, he would be ready. The pain of the past was no longer a defining part of his life. He had come to terms with it, learned from it, and allowed it to shape him into someone stronger and wiser. He thought about forgiveness again, not in the way he had originally conceived it, as something he had to offer Jenna to move forward, but as something he had already given to himself. Forgiveness wasn't about excusing the hurt that others caused. It was about freeing oneself from the grip of that hurt. It was a gift he had given himself. The sound of the cafe's door opening brought Leo's attention back to the present. He looked up and saw a couple walk in, laughing as they held hands. It reminded him of the days when he and Jenna had been happy, before everything had fallen apart. He didn't feel sad, though. He simply smiled and returned to his coffee, knowing that happiness was something he could create for himself, whether with someone else or on his own. In the end, Leo had discovered that life wasn't about avoiding pain or chasing after fleeting moments of happiness. It was about embracing the full spectrum of emotions, from the deepest hurt to the brightest joy, and understanding that everything, even the worst of experiences, had the potential to teach us something. As he left the cafe that day, Leo felt a sense of clarity he had never known before. His path forward wasn't defined by the choices he had made in the past. It was defined by the person he had become, the person who had learned to forgive, to let go, and to move forward with grace. And as he walked into the rainy streets, he realized that the journey was far from over. There were still twists and turns ahead, but he no longer feared them. Whatever came next, he would be ready,